Hello friends, welcome back. Let us continue with the discussion related to organizational change and development. In this session, I am going to talk about overcoming resistance to change. Till now, we discussed about factors which lead to resistance to change. In this session, I am going to talk about how to overcome resistance to change. It is very difficult to handle employees who are resistance to change, but ultimately change agents have to take some strong steps and subtle steps in order to convince employees that why that change is required. So, there are certain tactics that are being adopted by change agents to bring and introduce that change among employees and in the organization. So, change agents have identified 8 tactics which can help in overcoming resistance to change. The first is education and communication, participation, building support and commitment, develop positive relationships, manipulation and cooptation, coercion, selecting people who accept change and implementing changes fairly. So, these are some tactics which every change agent prefers to adopt in order to overcome resistance to change and help organizations develop. We can review them in detail. The first is education and communication. So, communication is the logic of a change can introduce employee resistance on 2 levels. The first is it fights the effects of misinformation and poor communication. For example, if we just go back to our previous discussions where employees focus on selective information processing. Do information processing sometimes may be on wrong information or misinformation that fosters resistance. So, ultimately the solution to such kind of problem is to educate and communicate employees. To communicate here means to tell the real picture that what change is all about only through communication and education. There they can reduce employee resistance by communicating or the correct information which will erode all the misinformation and poor communication, and when they receive the full facts and clear up misunderstandings, resistance is subsided. And the other is that communication can help sell the need for change by packaging it properly. Now, here packaging it properly means that change agents sell that idea for change to the target employees to convince them what it is all about by providing all the information and then telling them that how they can be benefited by such kind of changes. So, that becomes a package. So, it is a way to present that proposal or thought where the employees find that change very exciting and beneficial. A study of German companies revealed that changes are most effective when company communicates a rationale that balances the interest of the various stakeholders, that is employees, community, customers, shareholders, rather than those of shareholders only. So, any change that has to be introduced, the change agent have to identify the pros and cons or advantages and disadvantages of that change and to what extent any change is beneficial to the larger extent in the organization. So, it is not only about technology to be implemented, it is about that how the technology or change in policy is going to benefit not only a specific sector of employees, but every employee associated with that organization in terms of shareholders, in terms of stakeholders, employees, customers, even community. Another study of a changing organization in the Philippines found that formal change information sessions decreased employee anxiety about the change while providing high quality information about the change increased commitment to it. So, whenever that real communication and knowledge is shared with the employees for the change, it reduces anxiety and people become more adjustable and adaptable to that change. Therefore, education and communication carries that logic that when we are communicating that change, that means we are educating the employees about that change because it carries all the technical and non-technical information. Participation, it is difficult to resist a change decision in which we have participated. So, assuming participants have the expertise to make a meaningful contribution, their involvement can reduce resistance, obtain commitment and increase the quality of change decision. So, when employees are being brought up in the process of decision making to bring about change, then employees also get exposure to that new change. They understand the reason behind or rationale behind that change, and ultimately their anxiety also reduces and they become another change agents to communicate that changes to their co-workers. So, participation of employees in decision making process for a new change can help change agents to overcome resistance to change. The other is building support and commitment. When employees' fear and anxiety are high, counseling and therapy, new skills training or a short paid leave of absence may facilitate adjustment. Even if the change has been implemented, definitely employees are more anxious, they have more threat to experience. In order to give them some space and time to adapt to change in a very slow fashion, the organizations tend to offer new skill training programs in order to make the employees aware of that new change. So, gradually they adapt and adjust. Sometimes anxiety levels goes high and organizations take initiative to provide counseling and therapy in order to overcome those fears and anxiety that what will happen when that change will take place. So, it is about fear of unknown because they become uncertain about the changes that they will face. When all these behavioral aspects are being handled by the change agents, employees tend to overcome those change and become more committed to that change. So, employees also accept changes when they are committed to the organization. So, firing up employees and emphasizing their commitment to the organization overall can also help them emotionally commit to the change rather than embrace the status quo. So, it is about bringing subtle changes in the employees even after the major change and then identifying themselves as committed employees, and ultimately you are motivating them, charging them up because of their commitment to that change that keeps them motivated to overcome that change and accept that change. So, this tend to build support and commitment among employees. The other is develop positive relationship. People are more willing to accept changes if they trust the managers implementing them. So, it becomes a foremost duty and step of any change agent to interact cordially and build up trust with the employees and the co-workers in order to bring them change. So, whenever there is a trust between the employees and the change agent, it becomes easy to certain extent for the change agent to bring about change in the organization. One study of 235 employees from a large housing corporation in the Netherlands, it was found that those who had a more positive relationship with the supervisors and who felt that the work environment supported development were much more positive about the change process. So, it is about building positive relationship with the co-workers, because whenever there is positive relationship, trust will also exist and people will overcome resistance to change because they are trusting the change agent. So, whatever the change will happen, it will happen for good. Another set of studies found that individuals who were dispositionally resistant to change felt more positive about the change if they trusted the change agent. So, this suggests that if managers are able to facilitate positive relationship, they may be able to overcome resistance to change even among those who ordinarily do not like changes. So, even they are resist change, but since trust is there, so people will be willing to accept that change. So, therefore, developing positive relationship will play a very important role to overcome resistance. Fifth is implementing changes fairly. This talks about procedural fairness. We have already discussed in the previous sessions based on organizational justice. So, if change has to be introduced, then the process through which the change will occur, that procedure has to be very fair, that every section of the employee is getting benefited by that change. So, one way organizations can minimize negative impact is to make sure that changes are implemented in a very fair manner. Procedural fairness is especially important when employees perceive an outcome as negative. So, it is crucial that employees see the reason for the change and perceive its implementation as consistent and fair. So, this is how that the change has to be very rational in nature, and to certain extent it should fair in the distribution, in the process that it will be implemented, and that every employee is being benefited by that change based on procedures. Next comes manipulation and co-optation. Manipulation here means that we are twisting the fact in order to make the employees accept and understand the essence of change. So, manipulation refers to covert influence attempts twisting facts to make them more attractive, withholding information and creating false rumors to get employees to accept change are all examples of manipulation. When change agents understand that the employees are extremely resistant to change, then they also adopt this tact of manipulation where they withhold certain information, they will twist the facts, they will provide some different information about the change in order to influence employees, and the change can be implemented. Now, the point is that if management threatens to close a manufacturing plant whose employees are resisting an across the board pay cut, and if the threat is actually untrue, management is using manipulation. So, the point is that when the change agent is threatening the employees, maybe they will threaten in a way that if change is not accepted, then maybe their salary will be cut off, although it is not true, salary will not be cut off the board. But if this kind of statements are being used in implementing change, then ultimately it is manipulation. So, this is one way to introduce any change. The other is cooptation. It combines manipulation and participation. While hiring any person from the group of people who are resistant to change, they buy off and they try to assign some very important responsibility to that person, and ultimately when the person is in the loop, then they tend to adapt to that change. So, they tend to influence the person who is resistant to change while offering him some key responsibility, and as soon as that responsibility comes to that individual's shoulder, he is bound to accept that change. So, this is cooptation. It is about, it seeks to buy off the leaders of a resistance group by giving them a key role, seeking their advice, not to find a better solution, but to get their endorsement. So, they influence the person who is resistant to change, and ultimately the person gets influenced and they endorse that new change. Therefore, we can say that both manipulation and cooptation are relatively inexpensive ways to gain the support of adversaries, but sometimes they can also backfire, because once people tend to know that information has been withheld or twisted, then people tend to revolt. They only resist, but they also revolt to the change. Selecting people who accept change. For example, emotionally stable individuals are more willing to take risk and more flexible in their behavior. So, research suggests that ability to accept and adapt easily to change is related to personality. So, change agent will only identify people who are emotionally stable to understand the rationale for the change, and they will only include those people in the change process so that the change can be implemented accordingly. So, some people are simply more receptive to change. So, individuals who are emotionally stable and have high core evaluations, that means who evaluate themselves high in comparison to the other people and are willing to take risk and are flexible in their behavior, are the prime candidates to introduce change. So, change agent will identify people with such kind of personality traits who have high core self evaluations, who are risk taking, and ultimately who are more adaptable and receptive to change. So, they will select only those people who are adaptable, emotionally stable, so that they can assist them in implementing that change. Therefore, individuals with positive self concepts and high risk tolerance coped better with organizational change, and individuals higher in general mental ability are also better able to learn and to adapt to changes in the workplaces. So, this is about individual personality traits that are being traced by the change agent, select them accordingly to bring about that change. So, in general, teams are strongly motivated by learning about and mastering tasks. They are high in cognitive ability and have collectivist values, are better able to adapt to changing environments. So, it is about group level also, that the leader will only identify people who are able to understand things based on logics, based on rationale, and ultimately who can understand the collectivist value to bring about change in the group. So, it may thus be necessary to consider not just individual motivation, but also group motivation when trying to implement changes. And the last is coercion. This is the last resort basically, which is the application of direct threat or force on the resistors. They will give direct threat or force, implement force in order to bring about change in the organization. So, if management really is determined to close a manufacturing plant whose employee do not acquiesce, that means to accept something without argument, although you may not agree with it, to a pay cut, the company is using coercion. So, This is something again a force where the change agent will implement that change in a forceful manner by threatening employees that if they do not join, bring adjust to that change, maybe they will lose their job. So, even when employees are not agreeing to it, still they do agree to that change, that is coercion. Their resistance is not being considered at any point of discussion and interaction, and only the change is implemented. So, this is about coercion, which is a way, a threatening way to implement any change. It can also be in form of threat based on loss of promotions, cutting on salaries or bonuses, or negative performance evaluation. So, whenever such kind of coercion will take place in terms of threat, ultimately the employees will accept that change in a very forceful manner. The advantages and drawbacks of coercion are approximately the same as for manipulation and co-optation. So, this is another way, but these are the tacts as per the situation. The change agent generally adopt any these tacts which helps change agents to bring them change while overcoming resistance. Alright, what we have discussed till now about these 8 tacts about overcoming resistance to change, there are certain approaches also that has been introduced by OB scientists to manage organizational change. There are certain approaches which have theoretical assumptions that how change can be introduced in any organization. So, the first is Levin's 3-step model, the other is Kotter's 8-step plan for implementing change, action research and organizational development. So, we will start with Levin's 3-step model. So, this is Levin's 3-step model which talks about 3 processes: unfreezing, movement and refreezing. Change, any organizational process is existing and it is functional. That is the status quo, right, that this is how the organization is working. Now, at that point of time, the change is required and action has to be taken. When action is taken, the change is implemented, and as soon the change is adopted, imbibed and very much learned, again an action will be taken which closes that action, that this is how the organization will function. So, we are basically unfreezing, getting into a movement mode and then refreezing, that means we are freezing, the new change has become operational in the organization. This is the rationale behind Levin's 3-step model. Kurt Lewin argued that successful change in organization should follow 3 steps: unfreezing the status quo. The status quo, that this is how presently at this point of time the organization is functioning in this manner. This is the status of the functionality of any organization, and at this point we need to change. So, we are unfreezing that change which is already there and rooted well. At this point we are unfreezing, we are uprooting that change, right, and getting into the movement mode, which is movement to a desired end state, that we need to change in order to move to that new change which will lead to certain positive results. Movement is something, the desired end state, in terms of that what action should be taken in order to reach to that end state. So, movement talks about the changes, initiations we bring in to the organizational process, and refreezing the new change to make it permanent. As soon as the movement is over, the organizations adapt to those new changes, and when those new changes are very much rooted in the organizational structure, then again it has to be refreezed. Why? Because now that new system or new change has become permanent in nature, and this is how we lock that new change. This is about refreezing or locking a new change, because every member of the organization has adapted to that change. So, here where unfreezing is changing to overcome the pressures of both individual resistance and group conformity. So, when we are talking about the first step, unfreezing, this is about the changes that are being felt. Now, these changes can be in form of pressures also, that both individual and group level also confirms that this is at this point we need to change in terms of procedures, in terms of policies, in terms of technological advancements. So, this is the point where organizations feel that pressure at individual level and organizational level and group level, that we need to change, where movement is a change process that transforms the organization from the status quo to a desired end state. So, for example, if we need to, some group of people are working in quality control area, they understand the process, but at this time they feel some pressure that we need to introduce new technology where the technology or computerization has to take place in order to identify more defect and correct them, because there is more production. So, in order to bring into that change, that movement has to take place where new training programs are being introduced, more employees are being hired in order to implement that new change with new technology. So, this is about movement to the desired end state. So, what is the desired end state? That we need to improve the quality control area in terms of technology, in terms of selecting more personnel, because more production has taken place. So, we have to reach to that desired end state, right. So, this is about bringing some changes, and unfreezing is stabilizing a change intervention by balancing driving and restraining forces. Now, at this point, even that movement mode has been initiated because change has initiated, there will be some people who will resist also. It is not that all members have agreed to from unfreezing to movement. In that movement phase, maybe towards movement to refreezing, some members will be there who will resist and they become restraining forces. Now, those restraining forces can be a number of other forces as well, maybe financial forces, maybe technical restraining forces, or maybe skilled forces. So, this when this is being balanced, then ultimately the organization wholeheartedly accept those changes, and those changes become permanent and leads to a refreezing state, where we are locking and freezing that new change when everybody adapts to that change. So, this is how Levin's 3-step model functions based on unfreezing, movement and refreezing. So, here the status quo is at equilibrium state. To move from equilibrium to overcome the pressures of both individual resistance and group conformity, unfreezing must happen in one of 3 ways. Now, if I just go back, so even in unfreezing to movement, forces, resistance forces are also there. Even in movement for status also the resistance is there. Finally, refreezing is the stage where resistance has been overcome. So, here the status quo is an equilibrium state. So, to move from equilibrium to overcome the pressures of both individual resistance and group conformity, unfreezing must happen in one of 3 ways: the driving forces and the restraining forces, and the alternative to combine the first 2 approaches. The driving forces, which direct behavior away from the status quo, can be increased. Driving forces means the need for change. So, this is also there at the unfreezing state, that the need for change has been felt and that need is the driving state. The second is the restraining forces, which hinder movement away from equilibrium, can be decreased. Restraining forces, there can be number of restraining forces: financial forces, economic forces, psychological forces, or individual forces. Now, this force can be resistance also and other forces. So, as soon as the movement will take place, with the gradual process, the restraining forces also decreases. And the third alternative is to combine the first 2 approaches. So, in order to move from unfreezing to movement, these 2 forces can be combined in order to cope up and then initiate the change. So, this is something that starts at the equilibrium state, that is the unfreezing state, and leads to movement. So, companies that have been successful in the past are likely to encounter restraining forces because people question the need for change. As I mentioned, that resistance will be there at the unfreezing point and at the movement point also, movement node, and how organizations tend to overcome resistance to change. So, resistance to change is the major restraining forces at both the levels. So, research on organizational change has shown that to be effective, the actual change has to happen quickly. Organizations that build up to change do less well than those that go to and through the movement stage quickly. It is about accidental occurrence of the change or through change agent. So, if it is through change agent, then the driving forces and restraining forces has to be taken into consideration, right. And if it is quick, then definitely it is accidental and people do adopt. So, once change has been implemented, to be successful, the new situation must be refrozen so it can be sustained over time. Without this last step, change will likely to be short lived and employees will attempt to revert to the previous equilibrium state. Refreezing is the point where we are freezing, we are locking that process so that the employees should not go back to their comfort zone, they have gone through the whole process of the change through the change agent, and they have made them skilled enough through new training programs to adapt and adjust to the novel changes. So, here employees are being unfrozen or unfreezed in order to maintain that new status quo. Therefore, the objective of refreezing then is to stabilize the new situation by balancing the driving and the restraining forces. So, this is about the Levin's 3-step model. Other 3 models, that is Kotter's 8-step plan for implementing change, action research and organizational development. This we will continue in the next session. Thank you so much.